Thank you for the invitation. It's an incredible honor to get to have a conversation with Gerald Chertavian, who is an incredible CEO and founder of one of the most important, I think, youth-serving nonprofits in not just in Boston, but across the globe. He's been doing an incredible work, partnering with businesses, with other nonprofits, with education organizations, and it is an incredible honor. I just want to not give any more spoilers. He's going to be coming out and telling you all about his story and how he and his nonprofit Europe have been impacting young people across the globe. So with that, I'd like to welcome Gerald.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Hello to you all. Ezekiel, did you stay here in the audience? Where are you? First of all, thank you for what you're doing. I went to Lowell High School 40 years ago, and I can promise you that city, that community, that high school is better because of the perspective, the diversity, the generosity of spirit that you and your colleagues are bringing to it. I just want to say thank you for what you're doing. It's exactly what we need. So congratulations to you. Great, so we're here to talk about the pursuit. I want to applaud Hubweek for actually having the courage and the forethought to take on something so important, which is the pursuit of opportunity in our community in Greater Boston. There's perhaps nothing more important than people's belief that they have access to opportunity, they have access to economic justice. So thank you, Hubweek, for focusing on this. We think it's deeply important. I'd like to talk to you for a minute about the pursuit that I've had the opportunity to experience over the past 20 years. And I'd like to start with a story, if that's okay. So 32 years ago, I was working on Wall Street, and I joined the Big Brothers program. I was matched with a young boy from the Dominican Republic, Ezekiel, he was a lovely young 10-year-old boy. He happened to live in the most heavily photographed crime scene in New York City. That housing development was an incredible advance for his family because prior to that, he and his 4 brothers and his mom lived in shelters. So that housing development was a big step up. But 1987 was the height of the crack AIDS epidemic in our country, and it literally tore communities apart. I had the blessing to spend every single Saturday of my life with David, with his 4 brothers, with his friends, his cousins, in this housing development. And after 3 years of Saturdays, my life was completely different. Because I saw the most motivated, hardworking, smart young men and women I had ever met, and they had absolutely no idea, how do I get into the mainstream of this country? And I knew after those 3 years, it was largely because of their zip code, the bank balance of their mom, the school system they attended, and indeed the color of their skin that was limiting their God-given potential. And I think all of us know that's just wrong. It is wrong that people's potential get limited by those factors. And I also, at the age of, 23, thought that it was fixable, that you could do something about this, that we didn't have to live with a situation of wasting so much human capital in a country where we have absolutely no one to waste. I didn't realize at the time when I got to know David that the challenge he was experiencing is a systemic challenge in our country. We have millions of young people who look just like David. Millions who are out of school, out of work, don't have more than a high school education. And at the very same time, we have that incredible supply of talented labor. We have millions of jobs that, frankly, we don't know how to fill in this country. I bet every one of you here could talk about how hard it is to hire the skilled labor you need, find the talent you need. So we have a labor market in this country that isn't working. It's not clearing supply and demand. And so that's a tremendous drain on our country, on our economy, on our democracy. It has tremendous consequences for all of us, not just some of us. And so we stop and say, well, why is this occurring? Like, what's driving this? And, there are reasons. There are educational systems in this country that aren't working as well as we need them to. And I'll do one kind of raise your hand participation to prove one point. Raise your hand in this audience if you have a 4-year degree. Keep your hand up if you got it broadly between the ages of 18 and 22. Okay, put your hands down. I reckon about 85% of the hands were up in this auditorium. Now, if I ask those same two questions of any 100 adults over the age of 22 in the United States of America, those two same questions, how many hands do you think would be up? Someone take a guess. 30%? 20%? 12%. That's a lot closer. The answer is 8%. 8 out of 100 adults in this country today have a 4-year degree that they got between the ages of 18 and 22. Yet think of our educational policy and our systems. They're designed for the 8%. They're not designed for the 92% that often consume education and higher education in very different ways. In fact, the average age of a Bachelor of Arts is about 28 today in this country. So we have educational systems that aren't working as well as we need. We have employment systems that exclude whole swathes of human beings. Again, if you say you need a 4-year degree to apply for a job, right, if that's the policy, you've now excluded 86% of all Latinos and 79% of all African Americans in the United States of America. Like, do we think the HR wants to do that? Probably not. But that's the impact of policies that aren't consistent with how our citizenry is gaining education, gaining skills, learning today in this country. And sadly, it's resulted in tremendous inequality. In fact, the Globe on Monday published an article saying we have the highest inequality again this year, higher than last year. Remember when the Globe came out and said the average African-American family has $8 of net worth? They had to reprint the article and say this isn't a typo. Can you imagine that? This isn't a typo. Whereas the average white family has 6 figures of net worth. So the consequences of systems that don't work for our citizens affects all of us. And that's frankly why we had the opportunity, and I was fortunate enough to start a program to try to address that called Year Up. And in a nutshell, we work with low-income young adults, 18 to 24 years old, and in 1 year, enable those young adults to go from either no income or very low income to livable wage careers in the very best companies in this country. So you get 6 months of education, college credited, you learn professional skills, technical skills, something marketable. You then take those skills for 6 months and go to a great company, Google, Bank of America, JP Morgan, Harvard, MIT. You apply those skills, and guess what? Those companies say, man, you're talented. I want to hire you. Not just one, not just two, but hundreds, if not thousands, of young people who now have access and opportunity to show that God-given talent that I knew David had years and years ago. So that program, which we've now run for a few years, has looked like this in terms of its growth. So we started with 22 students who had the misfortune to have me as their teacher. We have now really capable teachers. This year we'll serve about 4,700 young people in 25 cities across the country. And I'm so proud to tell you that, yes, we have 17,000 alums today. In 5 years' time, we'll have more alumni than Harvard Business School has alumni in this country. I'm also proud to tell you that the randomized controlled trial that the federal government ran on our program concluded that we raise wages for low-income youth more than any other program in the history of the United States. So it works. 90% of those young people on average earn 21 an hour, right? That's 30% more than the average salary an American makes today in this country. The average individual income in America is about $30,000. So we're already 30% ahead of that. We have 3,300 graduates just in Boston alone. You can't walk downtown Boston without bumping into a graduate who pulls out a badge and says, I work at JP Morgan, Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, you name it. And you know what? They're now voting, buying homes, doing the things we want our citizens to do. So I want to shift now and I want to talk about what does this program actually mean for individuals. Does everyone know the building I'm showing here? It's the Suffolk County Jail. One of our wonderful graduates, Greg Walton, spent a year of his life in that building and in South Bay Prison. He was only 19, and he made a mistake. Just like the mistake many of us have made. He came out of prison, and he came to Year Up, which doesn't discriminate against folks who may have had involvement with the criminal justice system. He got accepted to Year Up. He did his 6 months of training. He did his internship at an employer who also didn't discriminate against him. There's a theme in this. And now for the past 13 years, he's now worked at the Massachusetts Institute for Technology, MIT. Think about the different pictures we create in our minds, because the picture I want to show you of Greg today is quite interesting. It's his LinkedIn profile. Greg, as you can see, has been at MIT for 12 years. He's also a motivational speaker. He was also the first graduate elected to our board of national directors, which is amazing. You think that's wonderful for Greg, but I want to tell you what the real impact is. Here's the real impact. That's Greg's family. He has 2 absolutely beautiful children. His wife, Alicia, is wonderful. And the picture you see is Greg receiving the coveted Distinguished Service Award at MIT, which they give to a handful of employees every year to recognize outstanding service. So Greg received one of those awards from MIT. And the final picture I'll show you is the picture of the new house he's building with his family. His grandfather called him the other day and said, no one in our family ever has built a home. And you know what? This isn't Greg's first home. They bought a home several years ago. They sold it. They took the profit from that, and they built this home. And they'll be moving Alicia's grandmother in with them as well, because she needs a home to stay in. And what I remember most about this is when Greg and I were talking, and he said, you know, Gerald, when you grew up like I did, I was in foster care. I was taken away from my mom when I was little. I'd never met my dad till I was in my 30s. I never knew any stability my entire life. He said, I now get to carry my children over the threshold of the home that we purchased with our hard-earned money. We get to cook dinner on that stove that we went out and picked together and purchased the stove we wanted. And every night of my life, we get to tuck those 2 children into a bed that they will never be without. He said, that, my friend, is probably pretty hard for you to understand how good that feels. But that's the pursuit, people. That's the pursuit we need for this country, to enable people to gain access to this type of opportunity. So I'll finish in just the last few minutes, because I think anyone hears that story, I do not want you to think for 1 second it's a miracle. It's a humbling reality. If you give someone an opportunity in this country, they will take it, they will work hard, they will achieve for themselves and their families. So Greg's story should not be, oh my goodness. It should be, isn't it sad there aren't hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of stories like that are normal in our society to make this the place we want. So I often think, well, what could we do individually? Go home today. What might you do today to impact this pursuit on a broader basis? So I think of a few things. For many years of my life, I thought, I can't get involved in education. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a politician. How do I get involved in education? Everyone in this room can get involved in education in this state, whether it's in the PTA, whether it's on the board of a local school committee, whether it was I did as on the board of elementary and secondary education, or as the chair of Roxbury Community College. You're a citizen of this Commonwealth. You can get up and say, I'm getting involved, and take the views and the perspectives you have and bring them into systems that often appear off limits. They are not off limits. We as citizens can influence those systems positively. The second thing I'll ask you to do, go back to your companies tomorrow, whenever you go back, go on your website, the hiring page, we're hiring. I want you to go down and see whether the job descriptions say 4-year degree required. And if they say required, I want you to call up HR, and sorry all the HR people, I'm probably causing a headache for them today. Call up HR and say, why do we do that? What's the empirical evidence we use that says that weeding people out by a 4-year degree, which is linked more to your bank balance than your SAT score in this country, if we weed people out like that, why do we think that gives us the best talent? Do we have evidence of that? Just ask HR. Can't hurt. If you get a really good answer, call me, because I haven't heard a good answer yet. Other than perhaps the person who operates on me, I'd like for them to have an advanced degree. But let me tell you, only 25% of the people J.P. Morgan hired last year needed a 4-year degree. So this is not something we have to carry on. So that's one thing you can do when you go back. Push people a little bit on those degrees. And the last thing is, we have to acknowledge we still live in a society that has racism, sexism, and lots of other isms. It is the water system within which we live. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? And I'd argue that we are all on this journey of trying to learn. I think many people in this room care deeply about creating a more equitable society. So we're on these journeys. I want to make sure those learning journeys are actionable, because learning isn't enough. Being more woke isn't enough. We have to take action. And so you think about, well, how do I stand up as an ally? How do I raise my hand and say, this room isn't diverse enough if I'm at a meeting at work that clearly doesn't represent the city within which we live? How do we make sure that we are not standing by and letting the status quo persist? Because we know the status quo is not what we want to pass on to our children. We have to do better, and we can do better. And frankly, rooms like this give me hope, because you're here for a reason, and you can be part of that change in this country. I finish with one slide that I often tell people, when you bury me, I only want 3 things on my tombstone: good father, good husband, and that photograph. That's it. I'm comfortable, because that photograph for me, which is of our graduates at the MLK Jr. Memorial in Washington, is to me a picture of what the country can look, feel, and be like. When every person gets up and says, I'm included in this society, I have access in this society, I'm not discriminated against because of my class, my race, my orientation, right? We can create those societies because our children are looking at us, the people in this audience, saying, how are you making it a better union, a better country? And they're going to hold us accountable, as they should, for doing that. But I tell you, rooms like this give me a lot of hope. I look forward to working with this community, however we can, as year up, to make it the city and the community we want to pass on to our children. So with that, I'm going to close and join my wonderful colleague, Natalia. Thank you.
Wow. So I've been a big fan of Europe for quite some time. I actually, Gerald, I don't know if you remember this, but I met you, I think it was in 2013 at your house. You were having a gathering with your family, but also with Europe students and prospective students. And you invited a bunch of people, bunch of partners, community organizations, one of which I was a part of at that time. And I was so impressed by your ability to really integrate your personal life with that deeper connection with students. And I'd love to start just by having you talk a little bit about that connection with students.
First of all, Natalia, I just want to say thank you for all your work on behalf of small businesses in this city. And thanks for the service work you've done, whether it was with College Bond Dorchester or others. I appreciate it. Look, I couldn't get up without having young people to serve. My life wouldn't compute if I wasn't in a position to serve young people. So my family's been so tolerant over the years. We have an open dinner table. So any night of the week, if we're in town, our graduates can come over our home for dinner. So it's generally, well, how many chickens to put in the pot tonight, depending on who's going to come over for dinner. And our children have grown up just with a very pluralistic dinner table. And so for me, when I think about active learning, it's not enough to learn. You have to make it part of your life. You have to be inquisitive. You have to learn from young people and listen. Let them teach you what's important, what they need in our society. So I think I've been very blessed to have a family that we're all on this journey together. We're all learning and hopefully doing good together. And I've never tried to balance life. I've never thought that was a good concept. I think about integrating life. If you love what you do, then why would you not want to do it on weekends or nights? Why would you not want to make it part of your broader existence? So for me, it's much more of an integration rather than I do work or I do home. It's all one and the same.
Well, and I think leadership is all about that, right? You have to live your values every single day. And I think Europe is an incredible, incredible example of how you do that. So one of my favorite things about Europe is really the integrity that you put into work and the integrity you give young people every day to stand up, to go to a job that they're proud of, to stand up tall and talk about that work. So I'd love to ask you, what is like the one thing that you wish people knew about both young people and about Europe that you don't think gets enough coverage or you don't think people really truly understand about your work?
So Europe's now served 28,000 young people, and it's been successful not because we're that smart or we're successful because our students have been overlooked and untapped for decades and decades. So our society looks at often a young person we have the privilege to serve and frankly may see social liability rather than economic asset. So if we could help people just to see our young people as for who they are, is bright, hungry, motivated, economic assets, the voters, citizens, mothers, fathers that will make our country great, as opposed to, is this someone I need to worry about and clutch my wallet, right? So we have to acknowledge the bias that exists in how we see other human beings and start to question that, start to surface it, and start to really push ourselves to say, am I seeing this person for who they are in their God-given ability, as opposed to who I think they are based on race, class, gender. So imagine if we could do that, right? If we could just change perception a little bit of who talent is, where talent resides, and where you go to look for talent if you're an employer in our society.
Absolutely. I mean, we have talent everywhere. Everywhere you go in the city of Boston, there's untapped potential. And I'm just really, excited to know that there's organizations like Europe continuing to try to figure out how to really tap that potential. So, 28,000 students in nearly 20 years. What's next for Europe?
So we know we have to add zeros to that number. And we're deeply proud of those 28,000. But the reality is we need to get to 280,000 or 2.8 million. So that journey has led Europe to work at a systems change level. In fact, we have working with many of the current presidential candidates on their policy ideas. How do they get economic mobility in this country? Right? We have less economic mobility than probably 130 other countries. Not one or two. There's 130 other countries where if you were born into the lowest 20% of the socioeconomic scale, you have a better chance of getting out of that than if you're born in that group in America. So that's the facts today. So we need our politicians putting economic mobility as a forefront agenda. And part of our job is to say, well, what policies, what systems need to change to engender that? So we work at a systems change level. We have also started a major initiative to empower other organizations to serve those young people at the level they need to, so that employers come to them for talent. So we're doing a lot of work. How do we help others do this work? And how do we change systems that ultimately mean you don't need a year up? Let's be honest, year up is here because of systemic dysfunction. We shouldn't look to grow year up. We should look to reduce the need for year up so that our current public systems enable young people to have the access and the opportunity they deserve.
So I have like 50 other questions and could probably keep going, but I want to make sure that we're able to turn over to the audience for questions. So I am going to ask one last question. So if you're here, you're probably engaged with making an impact somewhere in your community, in your lives. And so I want to know what's the piece of advice or parting wisdom that you would share with all of the change makers that are here today, especially on their pursuit for impact in the opportunity gap?
So usually when people ask me to share wisdom, that's code for telling me to keep it short.
Well, we have 30 seconds, so.
Yeah, so I would say I'd share Brian Stevenson's wisdom, which I'd hold in a lot more esteem than my own, which is Brian Stevenson is one of the greatest, I think, folks here in this country today would say you have to be proximate. If you want to solve a problem, if you want to get involved, you've got to be really proximate. So you want to help education, get to know children in schools. You want to work on the work we do, mentor young people, listen to them, understand their context. So I think the number one advice I would have that I learned from Brian, which is you have to be close to the action, close to the individual, in order to gain some of the knowledge you may need to better serve that individual.
Thank you so much, Gerald.
Thanks, Natalia.
Wonderful. So we have a couple of Hubweek staff for questions, so if you'd like.
Stand up? Yeah, thank you. First, thank you very much. Gail Marcus, I'm actually now a professor, but was in business, and I'm working with kids. One of the arguments that's been made is that we focus too much on four-year college education as opposed to apprentice trade, and that's one of our challenges in really spreading the wealth, if you will, and getting people working. What's your thought on that?
You know, I think we did a disservice to many of our young people in this country when we decried college for all and we left it as a monolithic four-year fixed-term residential idea. And it's almost cruel because you then priced that idea out of most people's grasp. Imagine that, where we grew up with a generation saying, if you don't go to college, and that college was a fixed idea, 4 years, residential, you go to college, and then you have no way of hope often to get hold of that economically. That's a definition of cruelty, right? So I believe in this country we have to both define, develop, and value multiple pathways into the mainstream, whether it's apprenticeships, vocations, 2-year, 4-year, credentials, certificates. Without question, one of the greatest things we could do is to start to change our view of when we say college, change the word to post-secondary and say there are multiple ways we can gain those post-secondary competencies and skills that make us valuable to an employer, and the fact that education sure as heck won't be 4 years fixed term, finish at 22. So we have to move beyond that. Part of it is incumbent upon us the way we perceive talent, and part of it is to better develop, fund, and allow those pathways to have access to things like financial aid to promote a broader range of pathways into the mainstream in this country.
Question right over here. Come right behind you.
Hi, how you doing? My name is Jake. Thank you very much. So I work at a company called Filtered, and we've built a technical assessment to assess skill set over resume for engineering companies. Mostly Delta, who we work with. We started in a rejection bin, and they hired actually 5 data scientists who didn't have a college degree. So I completely understand where you're coming from. The only thing is, there's keywords on resumes direct correlation with good performers and bad performers. So where do you foresee resumes in Europe going to help your students get into the careers that they want?
So, really good question. I'd probably add to the resume, it's also the network, right? So 80% of job interviews are gotten through a network of some description. Now think about this. I bet everyone here has been asked to, can you keep an eye on that resume for me? One of my friends just submitted it. Can you make sure that HR takes a look at it? That ends up being the majority of the way people get interviews. So I was so pleased that Jeff Weiner, the CEO of LinkedIn, who's on our advisory board, we've worked very, very closely with LinkedIn, is starting a multi-million-dollar effort to close the network gap that many folks from lower income backgrounds haven't developed those professional networks. So it's fascinating that now one of the biggest companies in America with 160 million people on their site is looking at connecting people in addition to helping to think about competencies over degrees, credentials over the 4-year degree. So I think it's a combination of how resumes will be viewed. We use something called a 7-second resume, which is a 7-second video of a young person where they create themselves that helps you to see them for who they are and what they bring to the table. That's gone viral across the country. We have companies using it as their sorting mechanism as opposed to the resume. So I think resumes will evolve to be more holistic and not just as linear as they are today. And I think we have to close that network gap for so many individuals who don't have access in this country.
Right front.
Thank you so much for your work. I am a student right now at UCLA, getting an advanced degree in mindfulness facilitation. You mentioned about knowing the bias or knowing your bias. Some of the students in my group have started an affinity group and we're reading Waking Up White. I'd like to understand what the group recommends as far as ways to open up other people's eyes to our implicit biases so we can dissipate them and start to move the society forward.
I think it's a great question, and I would argue that when you're in any position of power, you have the ability to set the agenda. So I run an organization. I can decide, what does the board do? Well, we actually had all of our board watch videos on redlining. We had all of our board map their journey to wealth next to a student. And they both sat down and said, well, where did your wealth come from? And just go back a couple of generations, where it did or didn't come from. So I think if you run a team, what do you put on the agenda? Like if you're personally inquisitive, I mean, not only my family, children have taken the Harvard bias assessments to understand what your implicit bias is, because we all have implicit bias. So I think it goes back to the comment I made around learning in action, which is it's not just enough to learn. You've got to use whatever power you have to try to make it a little bit more inclusive, thoughtful, surface the things that you may not know about or be uncomfortable speaking about, and make them addressable and comfortable from wherever you sit, your class, your teammates. I'd love, though, Natalia, to perhaps answer that as well, if you don't mind, Natalia.
Absolutely. So, at the city, we're constantly working through making people aware of kind of what the two Bostons exist in Boston are. And even though, there's incredible economic opportunity in the city of Boston, we have a lot of people who haven't been able to access that. And there's a lot of people who are blind and say, no way, Boston's not racist, or Boston isn't dealing with those inequities. And when I was working on Imagine Boston 2030, we really fought to make sure, and the mayor was 100% behind us, that we want to put that stuff up front. We want to talk about the city's history. We want to talk about what is plaguing our city every day. For me, I personally believe that you have to move yourself into an uncomfortable space. If you are comfortable in your everyday commute, in your everyday conversations, if in your everyday life, you are not doing something right. You're not learning, you're not exposing yourself. So I really challenge people, read that article that your, racist aunt maybe posted on Facebook. Read it and try to understand where they're coming from so that you can then have a conversation with them about what might be going on. Look at articles, look at music videos, look at, anything that's outside of your everyday life. And I think that's where you get to a really clear understanding of what somebody else's life is like and what somebody else is going through. And until we really do that, I think we're going to continue to spin in circles and try to solve for all of these social issues.
This will be our last question. Hi, my name's Lisa. I'm actually one of the people in the room that didn't raise their hand about a 4-year degree because I come from one of those families where it's not necessarily easy to achieve that based on economics. So I got my 2-year degree, so that was more attainable. But my question is about income sharing, and that's a new topic of discussion. So instead of getting $200,000-$300,000 in student loans or however much it's going to be, you're going to pay 10% of your income for 6 years after graduation. And that's a little bit of a relief as a person who thinks about education as something that is unattainable for a lot of people. Sometimes you're like, okay, that's more digestible than the student loan I can never pay back. So just, I guess, as somebody that's running a program like this, how do you feel about the income sharing aspect of being able to, return the favor once you get hired, as opposed to being, saddled with debt as soon as you graduate?
So it's a rising tide issue. Even the federal government right now is looking at ISAs as a way to fund higher education. If that happens, you'll create a whole new industry in this country. I and our board, in fact, we just had this discussion at our board meeting no more than a week ago, we're mixed. I think for the young people we serve who have come from underserved backgrounds, there's a question of whether we would be comfortable saying you now have to pay back. We'd much rather say, why don't you donate as a successful graduate to the Student Relief Fund or the Crisis Fund for the next student. To tie it in directly to an income share, there's a threshold at which it feels like it becomes acceptable of income and below which it feels like you're still saddling someone with a debt when they're making $40,000 a year. And trust me, life's not easy at $40,000 a year. So I think there will be an industry. I think certain people will opt into it. We as yet didn't feel that it was right for us to impose that on all of our students. Although I will say it was a conversation that we had and deliberated and concluded right now it didn't make sense for us. But that picture could change in years to come, especially if the federal government develops this as an industry, which they're literally doing as we speak. It would change the landscape for how we think about financing higher education. It's a great question. I think
so can we get a round of applause for Gerald, please? And Brandon.
And for Natalia, too. Thank you. Thanks,